So we're going to do Daf Mem Dalid in Mirz Hashem, and we fell behind by one Daf. We'll try to be mashlim that, but we're going to start now on Mem Gimel on the base, and hopefully we'll finish Mem Dalid today, up to Mem Hey in the morning. And if by chance you have any time in the afternoon, maybe we could do Mem Hey. So here on Daf Mem Gimel on the base, approximately a little bit more than halfway down, Ha'ish Mekadesh es Bito. And I have to apologize that at 8 o'clock we have some help coming in, so we'll have to take a break just to open up for them. So the Mishnah establishes that a father, was given a schus to be Mekadesh's daughter, even Shalom Midaita, and not only when she's a Ketana, but even if she's a Nara. Tanan Hassam, and now the Gemara brings a Mishnah from Masechet Gittin, which deals with Kabbalah's get in the case of Abbas. Nara Amurasa, so in other words, her father married her off when she was a Nara. But when I say married her off, it's only up to Erisin, because up to Erisin, if she gets divorced, she goes back to the domain, the rishus of her father. And he ve'avia mekablim es gita. And here we have the Shita, the Tanakama. We'll soon see that Rabbi Yehuda disagrees, that not only could the father be Makabel Haget when she's an Arab, but she herself is a Gedola L'chol Adinim, she's a Bar Das, and therefore she could be Makabel her own get. And that means that even if her father doesn't know anything about the get, she could receive the get, and there'll be a Chalos Gerushin. And we'll soon see that the logic here of the Tanakama is that she's going back to the Rishus of her father with the Gerushin, and therefore it's, so to speak, to his interest that she received this get. So even though he doesn't know anything about the get, she's Miskareshes. However, Rabbi Yehuda, the dissenting view, Rabbi Yehuda, Ein Shtei Yadayim Zochos Ke'echad. You can't have one goof, and with regard to this goof, there are two people who are going to be Zocha. And therefore, if the Torah said that Benureh Beis Avir, she's in the domain of her father during the period of Narus, therefore, Avir Mekabel es Gita, only her father could receive her get, and not she. And then the Mishnah concludes by saying, V'chol she'ein yechola lishmar es Gita, ein yechola lisgarish. If she's a Ktana, then she has the same status as a Shota because she's not a Bardas. And that touches on the principle that we've discussed in the past called Mishalcha V'chozeres, that even when he divorces her, she comes back, so to speak, to him, to the husband, because she doesn't have any concept or awareness of Gerushin. And therefore her get is not chal at all. And the same thing applies to a Ketana. And this is the way Rashi learns it over here. If you take a look at Rashi, Dima Maskil Nara Murasa, he writes, Hu Adin Ketana. However, Rashi contradicts himself in the next Rashi, Dibra Maskil Hi Ve'avir. And at the end of that Rashi, which is the fourth of the wide lines, he writes V'dafka Nara. Al Ketana Avia V'lohi. So according to Rashi at the end, which is actually Rashi's first position, as we'll soon see Tosas Dibra Maskil Tanan, in Rashi's first original position, he was of the opinion that a Ketana, her father, could receive her get. So even though she's Mishalcha V'chozeres, but nevertheless her father, so to speak, protects her and makes sure that she's not Chozeres. And now Rashi is saying that both in the case of Nara and in the case of Ketana, there is no Gerushin. In the case of Ketana, she's a Shota. In the case of Nara, she's not a Shota, so she's now a Bardas, and she's a Mishalcha V'yena Choseres. But Rashi, at the beginning of the Rashi, in Dibra Masel Nara Muras, as we pointed out, Rashi says, Hu Adin L'Ketana. So it means that according to this Rashi, he changed his mind from his original position. He holds that even in the case of a Ketana, her father could not receive her get on her behalf because she herself is excluded from Gerushin insofar as she's a Meshalcha V'chozeres. And Tosas, Dima Masel Tnan, quotes the last Rashi, Pirush HaKunshis Dafka Narav Ketana Divrei HaKol Avia V'Lohi, to the effect that according to Rashi's position, which again, as we said before, is Rashi's original position, a Ketana, in the case of a Ketana, the father could be Makabel HaGet. Now, Tosas himself, at the very end of the Tosas, you'll see Vishuv Chazer Bo Rashi, the Gia Beperusho, Dinokat Nara V'hu Adin Ketana, which means that even in the case of a Ketana, she's a Meshalcha V'chozeres, and therefore the father could not be Makabel her get. So this is where Rashi apparently vacillated back and forth on this issue as to whether or not a Ketana is included in Gerushin, meaning that the father could be Makabel her get on her behalf. Rashi's original position was of the opinion that Dafka Nara, but in the case of a Ketana, her father can receive the get. But Rashi's ultimate position, after he changes his mind, is Huadin L'Ketana, that even in the case of a Ketana, the father cannot be Makabel the get on behalf of his daughter who's a Ketana. Tosas disagrees, and Tosas is of the opinion that in the case of, in other words, Tosas accepts Rashi's final conclusion. Tosas accepts Rashi's original position that in the case of a Ketana, the father could be Makabel the get. Omer Reish Lakish, Ki machlokes l'gerushin, kach machlokes l'kiddushin. So Reish Lakish is of the opinion that just like the Rabbanon and the Shita Rabbi Yehuda dissenting argue about gerushin in the case of a Nara who has a father, and whether or not she could be Makabel HaGet, the Chacham say yes, she could be Makabel HaGet, and Rabbi Yehuda says no, because Rabbi Yehuda's position is Ein Shtei Yadayim Zochos Ke'achas, Kach Machlokas B'Kiddushin. In other words, according to Reish Lakish, the Chacham hold that in Kabbalah's Kiddushin, a Nara, despite the fact that she has a father, she can receive her own Kiddushin. And the father doesn't even know anything about it. Even though keep in mind that by receiving her own Kiddushin, she's leaving the domain of her father. And Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that no, only the father could be Makabel her Kiddushin. Rabbi Yochanan Omar, he disagrees with Reish Lakish in terms of how to understand the Chachamim Shita. Machlokas l'gerushin aval l'kiddushin divrei kol avia v'lohi. Rabbi Yochanan holds that the Chacham accepted the view of Rabbi Yehuda with regard to Kiddushin. And the Torah gave his chus to the father to be Makabel Kiddushin, bin Urev Beis Aviyah, and she's excluded from Kabbalah's Kiddushin. And the Gemara tries to explain now the position of Rabbi Yochanan. The Omer Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina, my time with the Rabbi Yochanan, I'll leave it to Rabbanan. Why does Rabbi Yochanan hold that the Chachamim will agree and concede to the position of Rabbi Yehuda with regard to Kiddushin, and only the father could be Makabel Kiddushin? Gerushin machneses atzmil shusavia bein hiu bein avia. She can be Makabel her own get as a Nara because it's nichale, it's a good thing for the father that she goes back to the rishus of the father, as long as she's a Nara. And what I forgot to mention before, let me emphasize it now, is that it's dafka from Mina Eris. Whereas Rashi, again, if you go back to Rashi, Diber Amaschil, he v'aviha, which is again the fourth of the in the fourth line of that Rashi, which is the fourth of the wide lines. He says dafka min erisin of min asuin he v'lo aviha. Once the father gave over his daughter as a nara for nesuin, that there was knisa lechuppah, mishanisis ein lavir reshuspa, and then clearly only she could be makabel Kiddushin henceforth. But we're talking about now mina eris. And in the case of Kiddushin, Chachamim, according to Rabbi Yochanan, agreed to Rabbi Yehuda's position because mafkas atzmu reshus avi avi v'lohi, that if she'll be makabel Kiddushin on her own behalf, she's basically taking herself out of the reshus of her father. And that she can't do because the Torah was mezaka the father in Kiddushin. So that according to Rabbi Yochanan, there's no machlok between Rabbanan and Rabbi Yehuda with regard to Kiddushin. In the case of Menara, both agree that only the father could be makabel the Kiddushin. And now the Gemara raises the following objection, which is going to lead the Gemara to offer a second explanation, an alternative for Rabbi Yochanan. In fact, the Gemara v'harei maimar demifkas atzm reshus aviyah. Now, when a woman falls for yibum, according to the Torah law, it's through the Masechet Bia, the yibum, that the yavam is mekadesh the yavama. But if he gives her maimar and he says haret mekudeshes li with kesef zeh or b'shtar zeh, then in such a case, she will need not only chalitza to marry someone min hashuk, she'll also require a get because the maimar creates regular ishus that requires a get to be mater her. Utnan, and despite this all, and here we're going to begin daf mem dal, our daf for today. Ktana mina erisin ein osin ba maimer el midas avia. And the brisa here is emphasizing that we're talking about, I should say the Mishnah, we're talking dafka about a ketana. Then in the case of a ketana, there's no mimer unless the father agrees to the mimer to be makabel the kesef kiddushin, because she hasn't had nisuin yet. She was only a nara, and therefore she never left the reshus of her father, and he's zakai b'kiddushel. But Vanara, in contrast, if she became an almonim in an asuin, then beimidas atzmu, beimidas avia, that she could be makabel her own kiddushin without the haskama, without the agreement of her father. So we derive from this Mishnah that even a nara is mafkias atzmu reshus avia, and yet she could be makabel the kiddushin. And through that, she's machneses as atzma l'shus hayavam, even if the father objects. So you can't tell me that the reasoning of Rabbi Yochanan in the Chachamim to be machal between Gerushin and Kiddushin is because in Gerushin she's going back to the reshus of the father, whereas in Kiddushin she's leaving the reshus of the father. Because in the case of Maimar, she's leaving the reshus of her father, entering into the reshus of the yavam. She's being mafkia atzma avia, and yet it says over here, Beimidas Atzma, Beimidas Avir, that she can receive her own Maimah. Eli Yitmar, therefore, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina has to be reinterpreted in terms of his explanation of Rabbi Yochanan. Hachi Yitmar. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina, my time with Rabbi Yochanan, I'll leave it to Rabbanan. What is the distinction between Gerushin, where a Nara could receive her own get, even without her father's knowledge, and in contrast Kiddushin, she cannot receive her Kiddushin without the father's agreement. Kiddushin de midaita of Yavalohi, Gerushin de Balkarcha, bein he ubein avia. The question is whether the Kinyan requires dasmak. If you take a look at Rashi, Dibra Maskil Kiddushin de Midaita, 4 lines down from the top, he says the Ve'inon das Makna. So with regard to Kiddushin, we need das Makna. And the Isha, the Nara, she's das Makna. However, in Gerushin, there's no das Makna, and therefore, in the case of Gerushin, the Nara herself could receive her own get even without her father's knowledge. But in the case of Kiddushin, since the entire kinyan of Kiddushin depends critically on das Makna, who is the das Makna? The Torah gave the das Makna over to her father. And therefore, her father could be Makabel Kiddushin, v'lo he. So again, basically what Rabbi Yochanan now is saying in the Chachamim is a kind of application of Rabbi Yehuda's principle of Ein Shtei Yadayim Zochos Biachas. So again, if there's no need for das, then the Rabbanan disagree with Rabbi Yehuda. They hold that with regard to Gerushin, she, like her father, could be Makabel her get. But once you introduce the element of das, there can be only one das Makna. Who is the das Makna? And Ein Shtei Yadayim Zochin Kachas, you cannot have 2 das Maknas on one goof. And therefore, in the case of Kiddushin, which is das Makna, the das Makna is that of the father. The Torah was Mezakah the father, and therefore she cannot be Makabel her own Kiddushin. So the Gemara again raises the following objection: Varei Mamar Dimidaita. Maimer is chal only with das, so you need das Makna for Maimer like Kiddushin. And nevertheless, uktani, bein he, ubein avia, that she could be makabel her own maima. How could that be? We just finished saying, according to the explanation of Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yochanan, that in a case of das makna, ein shtei yadayim zochos kachas. So how could it be that in the case of maimar, both the father and her can receive kiddushay maimar? Again, we're talking about a nara that was an almana min erisin and fell fiyima. So we see that even when we need das makna, you could have a das makna of the isha, the nara, in addition to that das makna of the father. And the Gemara answers, "Chasam b'maimer debal korcha v'rebihi." What the Mishnah is referring to there, or some say it's a brisa, is Rebbe Shita Desanya Ha'osa Maimer b'yivimta shelo midata Rebbe Omer. Rebbe holds that if Maimer was done in a Yavama and he threw kesef into her rishus and he said a Rebbe Kudeshesli or a shtar, that even though she objects, the Maimer is Kona. And the Gemara is going to compare it to Yibam, which is also Bal Korcha. So you see that according to Rebbe, there's no din of das makna with regard to Maimer in a Yavama. And therefore, when the Brisa says that she, like her father, could be Makabel Maimer and generate a need for a get, and Chalitza is not going to be enough to be Matar L'Shuk, that's reflective of the Shita Rebbe, but Chacham Omrim Lo Kana. And therefore, according to Chacham, the Maimer without das makna is meaningless, and to be Matar L'Shuk, all you need is Chalitza. There's no need for a get. My time with the Rebbe, Gomar Mibia to Yavama. Rebbe is going to compare Maimar to Yibum itself in the case of a Yavama. So in other words, the Torah says that to be Kona Yavama, you need Bia. And we're now going to expand it and find another way of being Kona, and that's through Kiddushin, which is called Maimar. And that's going to work and operate just like Bia and Yavama. And therefore the get is going to be Chal even Bal Karcha, Ma Bia Divam Bal Karcha, Afhocha Nami Bal Karcha. And therefore she'll need a get in addition to Chalitza. That's the sheet of Rebbe for Rabbanon. But the Rabbanon disagree with Rebbe. Savri Alfina Kiddushin. After all, Maimer operates within the framework and according to the rules that govern Kiddushin. Ma Kiddushin Midaita. You could only effectuate Kiddushin Midas, you need a das makna, is Afhachanami to Midaita. Here too, in the case of Maimar, which is like Kiddushin, just the case of Yavama, but otherwise it's Mamish Kiddushin with the Kesef and Shtar. Therefore, she requires Das in order to effectuate and validate the Maimar as Kiddushin and require a get. So the Chacham say that in a case where there was no Das and it was Bal Karcha, the Maimar is not Chal, it doesn't generate issues, and there's no requirement of get, and all you need is Chalitza. But my Niflagi, Rebbe Sabra Mili di Yavama mi Yavama Havi Leila Melech. Since we're dealing with Kiddushin Maimar and a Yavama, where the Kiddushin is sort of like a preliminary Bias Yibum, therefore it's governed by the laws of Yibum. For Rabbanan Savri Kiddushin Avilan Lamelech. We should derive the dinim of Maimar, which is in effect Kiddushin, from the general dinim of Kiddushin. And just like Kiddushin cannot be chal without das, and you need a das makdisha, so too Maimar requires das. Now the Gemara wants to suggest a raya to Shitas Rabbi Yochanan, and the way we explain the Bryce. It makes sense what Rabbi Yochanan says, that in Kiddushin, in the case of a Nara, her father could be makabel the Kiddushin, but not her. In the Sefer, the Brisa sets up a contrast between Maimar and Kiddushin, whereas Maimar could work and operate and valid even without Das, Bal Karcha. Nevertheless, Kiddushin requires Das, and therefore she cannot be Makabel Kiddushin. Only the father can be Makabel Kiddushin, but not the Bas, even though she's a Nara and she's a Bas Das. So you see that the Brisa holds clearly, it's absolutely evident from this Brisa that in Kiddushin, the father's Makabel Kiddushin, but not her, like Rabbi Yochanan. And we're going to have to explain the difference between Maimar and Kiddushin, that Maimar is Rebbe Shita, and Rebbe holds that Maimar operates and is valid even Bal Karcha, whereas in the case of Kiddushin that requires Das, it's only the father that has the Das and not the Bas. So now we ask, name it heavy tuv to the Reish Lakish. Should we now assume that this Brisa is going to upslug Reish Lakish? According to Reish Lakish, even in Kiddushin, the Chacham agreed that only the father can be Makabel the Kiddushin. I'm sorry. Scratch that, sorry. According to Reish Lakish, the Chacham hold that in Kiddushin, even the Nara herself could be Makabel her Kiddushin. So what does it mean when it says Masechet Kebe Kiddushin? Amalcha Rabbi Yomi, Amalcha Reish Lakish, Amani Rabbi Yehudi, the Omer Ein Shtei Yadayim Zochos Kachas. The author of this brisa is Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yehuda holds that in the case of get, only the father can be makabel a get because Ein Shtei Yadayim Zochos Kachas, and the same thing applies to Kiddushin. But according to the Chachamim of Rabbi Yehuda, we're going to say that just like in the case of get, the daughter, Nara, like her father can be makabel a get, so to a Kiddushin, she could be makabel her Kiddushin. Fact the Gemara, Rabbi Yehuda, if you're going to read this brisa carefully according to Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that in the case of a Nara, whether it be get or whether it be Kiddushin, only the father can be makabel and not the Bas. So why does the brisa say Masha Ein Kein Kiddushin? Masha Ein Kein Gerushin mi boiler. Let's go back to the root. I mean, Rabbi Yehuda holds that in the case of a Nara, even for Gerushin, she cannot be makabel her own get. So if the Brisa should tell me a bigger chiddush here and differentiate between Gerushin and Maimar, to tell me that even though there's a certain similarity between them, but nevertheless, in the case of Gerushin, we're saying that only the father could be makabel. In other words, let's say it this way. If the Bryce is trying to convey the difference and the contrast between Gerushin and Maimar, meaning that in both cases, the Baal could give the Isha Bal Karcha, then in the case of Maimar, was saying that she and her father could be makabel, And the contrast now should have been that in Gerushin, that's not so. Only the father can be makabel. Gemara says, Einochinami. You're right. The Brisa should have told me the difference between Maimar and Gerushin. That would have been a bigger chiddush. But I did the Tani Maimar, the Tani L'Kiddushin, Tani Nami Masha Ein Kevi Kiddushin. Since the Tana is teaching us the din of Maimar, which is fundamentally similar to Kiddushin, he also mentions Masha Ein Kevi Kiddushin. So that we understand the difference, the contrast between Maimar and Kiddushin. So even though there would have been a bigger chiddush to differentiate between Maimar and Gerushin, but since he's dealing with Kiddushin, so he finishes up with Kiddushin. Gemara asks the following question: Rabbi Yehuda Maishno Maimar. Why is it that in Maimar, as opposed to Gittin and Kiddushin, where the father is the only one who could be Makabel, but in Maimar, it's not only the father, but even she could be Makabel the Maimar. And even in Gerushin, which is Bal Korcha, nevertheless, Rabbi Yehuda holds that only the father could be Makabel and not her. So more answers, Hoil the Skuka ve'omedes. It's Kiddushay Maimar are not a brand new kinyan. They're just completing the kinyan of Zika, which was Chal with the death of the first husband. And therefore, any way that you could be Tofes is sufficient. And that would mean even Malkarcha, or even in the case of the Bas herself, the Narashi could be Makabel Maimar. But in a case where the Baal is coming to Mekadesh or Kinyan Gomor of Kiddushin or giving her a get, she cannot be Makabel without the idea of her father. So the Gemara has explained the difference, the contrast between Maimar on the one hand and Gerushin and Kiddushin on the other hand, based on Skuka ve'omedes. And this goes according to Reish Lakish, who holds that we make no difference between Gerushin and Kiddushin. And now the Gemara wants to suggest that we can accept that distinction based on Skuka ve'omedes to justify Maimar, even according to Rabbi Yochanan. V'hashli osus lahachi, Rabbi Yochanan nami lo tikshi loch meikar. The original kasha, back when we asked the kasha on Rabbi Yochanan, and therefore we had to switch and offer an alternative interpretation of Rabbi Yochanan's shita in the Chachamim, what was that original kasha? We asked, according to Rabbi Yochanan, who made the distinction between Gerushin, where the Nara herself could be Makabel Haget, as opposed to Kiddushin, where she cannot, because in Gerushin she's going back into the Rishus of the father, and Kiddushin she's mafkia herself from the Rishus of the father. And we asked the question, what about Kiddushin Maimar? But now we have a teretz to that kash. We go back to the original pshat in Rabbi Yochanan, Shiny Maimar, holds Kuka ve'omedes. We'll apply the same logic that we applied to Rabbi Yochanan in the context to Reish Lakish in the context of Rabbi Yochanan. And that means that Maimar is different, because even though in Maimar she's being mafkia herself from the Rishus of the father, but nevertheless any kinyan, even a lightweight kinyan, is sufficient because she's holding Kuka ve'omedes. It's not a brand new kinyan to create issues. It's within the framework of Zika. And the Maisa Kiddushin is only a Gemara kinyan. It's only to complete the kinyan, and therefore she could be Makabel. Now the Gemara asks a kasha on Reish Lakish from the Mishnah here at the beginning of the parak on Daf Mem Alpha. Ish Mekadesh is Bito Kshinara Bo Ubishlucha. Now that means that a man could send a shliach to be mekadesh an isha on his behalf, and now the Gemara is medayik. Bo b'shlucho in, bo b'shlucha lo. The father or his shliach could receive kiddushin for his bas. But she herself or Hashliach could not be Makabal Kiddushin because he needed the Sa'ah. Truth to the Reish Lakish, who says that according to the Chacham, just like in Get, she can be Makabal her own Get, so to Kiddushin, she can be Makabal her own Kiddushin. Reish Lakish, Hanami, Rabbi Yehudi. Rabbi Yehuda holds that even in the case of Get, it's only the father who could be Makabal Kiddushin because Ein Shtei Yadayim Zochos Ka'achas. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, the same din applies to Kiddushin, according to Reish Lakish, that only the father could be Makabal Kiddushin, but the Chacham hold that even the Bas herself, the Naira herself, could be Makabal Kiddushin. Frekti Gemara Umimatzis Mukmis Leila Rabbi Yehuda. Now, I'm going to just give my own personal introduction to the following piece of the sugya. I think what the Gemara wants to assume is that all the Mishnayos, one after the other, should reflect the same sheet of the Tanoim. If we could prove that a later Mishnah in this parak, Haish Mekadesh, is not reflective of the sheet of Yehuda, then even the first Mishnah could not be reflective of the sheet of Yehuda. You and I might have said the following. Okay, the first Mishnah is Rabbi Yehuda. The next Mishnah is Reb Shimon. But the Gemara seems no. If I can prove to you that the next Mishnah is Reb Shimon, then it can't be that the first Mishnah is Rabbi Yehuda. And at the end of the tunnel, we're going to go through a long tunnel here, we're going to come to the conclusion that our first Mishnah in the second parak of Kiddushin is Reb Shimon, not Rabbi Yehuda. But again, we have a while till we get there. Can you tell me that the Mishnayos are going according to the Shita of Yehuda Katani? Safer. Let's go to the next Mishnah on Daf Memvav. Homer Lisha is Kachi Liba tomorrow Zo. Is Kachi Liba Zo. What happens is he repeats the word Kiddushin twice, which separates the Maisa into two different Maisa. So B'Tmura Zo, we'll call it Tmura Tamra Aleph and then Tamra Beis. Then, unless there's a Shava Pruta in one of those two Tamros, then the Kiddushin is not Chal. Why? Because they're two separate Maisa Kiddushin. If he would have said to us, Kachi Li, Bizu, then you could integrate the two Tamras to get the Shava Pruta to validate the Kiddushin. So each Nesinas Tamar, in the case of Iskachi, is a separate Maisa Kiddushin unto itself. And the Kiddushin can't be Chal unless there's at least a Shava Pruta in one of the other Tamar. If I'm reading my Tana, who is reflective of this Shita of Iskachi, because he repeated the word Iskachi, it sets up two Maisa Kiddushin. If he would have said Iskachi li bezu without repeating the word Iskachi, then we can integrate the two Tamars to create a Shal Pruta Shabim Mekudeshes. Amarava, Reb Shimon, this Shita of the Mishnah depends whether he repeated the word Iskachi is reflective of the Shita of Rabbi Shimon. Now, where is Rabbi Shimon coming from? We are now jumping to Seder Nezikin, and we're talking about what's called the Shvuas HaPikadon, which means that if a shomer takes a false oath, and then we find out the truth, he has to bring a Karban Asham, which is called an Asham Gzelos. And now the question is, how many Kfiros did he take? In other words, when the Mafkid demanded that the shomer return the object, and the shomer was kofer, and then he took a shvua to that effect. So does he bring one korban if there were multiple kfiros? So Achi Yomar Shvua L'chol Echad V'Echad, the key of keys, and this reflects the Shita of Shimon, is repetition of the word Shvua. So let's say, for example, a whole bunch of people would be Tovea the Shomer. So there's one Shomer and multiple Mafkidim. And then he says, the Shomer, Shvua She'en L'cha B'yadi, Shvua shein lecha biyadi, shvua shein lecha biyadi. He looks at each one of the tovim, the mafkidim, and he used the word shvua time and time again. He'll have to bring multiple karbanos because he took multiple shvuos. Each shvuo is machai b'karbanos ham zelos. If, on the other hand, he said to all of them, shvua she'ein lecha biyadi v'lo lecha v'lo lecha v'lo lecha, without repeating the word shvua, then he only is chayv one karban. And so too, Rabbi Shimon holds in Kiddushin that if he said his kachi once and he didn't repeat his kachi, then we can integrate all the tamros into one Masechet Kiddushin. And therefore, if there's a Shava Pruta in the total number of all the tamros, by integrating them all, then she's Mekudeshes. So it all depends, says Reb Shimon, whether he repeats the word as kachi. And we saw that in Reb Shimon in the case of a shvua, if he repeats the word shvua. So we see that the Mishnah later on of his kachli b'tmarazu, his kachli bazu, which invalidates the Kiddushin unless there's a Shav Prut in one of the two Tamers, is the Shita of Rabbi Shimon. So how can you tell me that our Mishnah at the beginning of the parak is Rabbi Yehuda? But and if you'll argue, Kula Rabbi Yehudi, Ubiprate Savala Kerevi, Rabbi Shimon. Maybe the Mishnah is according to Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yehuda accepts the opinion of Rabbi Shimon that it all depends upon whether he repeated the word shvua or, in the case of Kiddushin, repeated the word hiskachi. So the Gemara rejects this. Umi Savala, is it possible to say that Rabbi Yehuda accepted the shita of Shimon that in Klolim it all depends upon whether or not he repeated the key word shvua or the key word Kiddushin, and zaklal. Now we're learning a brisa that records a number of shitos amongst the Tana, and we'll see if we can keep a scorecard here. Zaklal. Okay, so now this brisa is going to begin by opening with the shita Rabbi Meir. Klal, if a shvua of the shomer, the shvua and the shomer was kolel all the different tovim, the mafkidim as we called them, and he took one shvua for all of them together, eino chayev elachas. He's only chayev for one shvua, one karban. But parat, if on the other hand, he distinguishes with a pirut in his shvua, and he takes a shvua to each one of the tovim, chayva kolachas v'yachas, to be Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, shvua lo lecha, lo lecha, lo lecha. If he leaves out the vav, he just says lo lecha, lo lecha, lo lecha, then it's considered as if he took one shvua to all of them. There was no vav ha mechalik. Just 1 second. Let me go over this one more time. Again, according to Rabbi Yehuda, he said shvua lo lecha, lo lecha, lo lecha, without a vav. And he did not repeat the word shvua. It's considered as separate shvuos. V'chayev al kolachas v'yachas. Very good. We got it right. But if he had said shvua lo lecha v'lo lecha and added a vav, then it's a vav hamachaber. Sorry, I made a mistake. I said vav hamachalik. I meant to say vav hamakaber, and that integrates everything into one shvua, and therefore he's only going to be chayav one carbon because he added the vav. So you see clearly that according to Rabbi Yehuda, it doesn't depend upon whether he repeated the word shvua. That's Reb Shimon. But it all depends upon whether he said v'lo lecha or just lo lecha. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, lo lecha, lo lecha, lo lecha, lo lecha, shvua. It all depends on whether he said the word shvua at the beginning of his statement or at the end of his statement. is since he said shvua at the end of his statement, if he had said shvua at the beginning of his enunciation, and then he was mefared, is then it's considered one shvua for all of them, because he started with the word shvua. It all depends according to Reb Shimon if he repeats the word shvua. Anyway, we see clearly that Rabbi Yehuda did not accept the sheet of Reb Shimon in Klali Prati Ukla. So therefore, you can't say that our Mishnah is Rabbi Yehuda and the Seifa, which is the sheet of Reb Shimon, that it all depends on how many times he used the word shvua, reflects the sheet of Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Yehuda accepted Reb Shimon, when we know for a fact Rabbi Yehuda rejected Reb Shimon. Elakula, Rabbi Shimoni. Let's go the other way around. That's what I indicated earlier. And we're going to say that the entire Mishnah is here in the second parak reflects the sheet of Reb Shimon. Ubishlichus savala ki Rabbi Yehuda. And Reb Shimon accepted the sheet of Rabbi Yehuda that ain't shtei yadayim sofos kaf. I just want to point out that the word of shlichus is a little bit misleading. We're not talking about shlichus here. What we're talking about is the father being Mekadesh his daughter. In other words, if she would be Mekabel her get, in the case of a Nara, that would make it like a shlichus. It's like, she's like the shliach, or we'll see later, the yad of her father. Excuse me for 1 minute.